Hi, this is Mrs. Jackson. This is the first video of Chapter 3, which is titled Polynomial Functions. The essential question we're asking in this chapter is, what can the rule for a polynomial function reveal about its graphs? And what can the graphs of polynomial functions reveal about the solutions of polynomial equations? And just kind of think about that in the context of maybe a sport. So all sports have certain rules that govern the sport. If we look at an example like tennis, there's rules about, is the ball in or out of bounds, or how does a player get points, or what kind of fouls there are. And so think about if you can actually learn the rules just by observing the game being played. That's kind of what we're going to be doing with polynomial functions. Can we observe the graphs and understand something about the function rule? In other words, its equation. So that's really what we're trying to ascertain in this chapter. This first section should be a review, and in it we're going to classify polynomials by both degree and number of terms. Okay, so let's get started. How can we classify polynomials? Well, let's first talk about what a polynomial is. The root word poly means many. So a polynomial is an expression that has one or many terms being combined. And combining is what we do when we are adding and subtracting. So combining does not mean multiplication or division. Okay, to classify a polynomial, we always rewrite it with the terms in descending order. So in standard form, descending order of exponents. And we're kind of already familiar with that, given our work with quadratics. So we have an example here below of several terms, and we're going to rewrite it in standard form. The first thing to note here is we're going to look for the highest exponent, and right here is our highest exponent, and that is an exponent of 4. I'm going to put that as the first term, and when I do so, I need to capture its, this is subtraction here, but I'm going to use that as the sign of that first term. So we've got to grab that along here. So I'm going to put negative 3x to the 4th power. And the second largest exponent is going to be right here, negative 5x cubed. So I'm going to grab that and put it here. And the next highest exponent is an invisible 1 here on the 2x. There's an invisible 1 there that we don't bother writing. And so that's going to be our next term. Oops, I forgot my 2. And finally, the last term is a constant of 6. Okay, so a couple of vocab terms here. The first thing is the number in front of the term with the highest exponent. That number is called the leading coefficient. We're going to be using that expression quite a bit in this chapter because it does have a lot to do with the graph, as we've already seen when we studied quadratics. So our leading coefficient here, and I usually abbreviate here, our leading coefficient is negative 3. That highest power there that we see, this 4, we call that the degree. So our degree is the largest or highest power. I'll say biggest exponent or biggest power. So in our case here, our degree equals 4 of this polynomial. And the last thing I wanted to highlight is how many terms. So terms are sort of the pieces that are being added or subtracted, in other words, combined. And so in this example, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. Okay, so let's see how we can classify this. We're going to start out by looking at two ways of classification. So one way is to classify by the degree, and the other way to classify by the number of terms. So these tables are going to help you understand some key vocabulary. So the first thing is if we have our highest exponent is a 0, okay? Right here, highest exponent is a 0. That would mean we have a degree of 0. And a degree of 0, we would call that a constant. If our highest, and by the way, you never actually see that exponent of 0. Likewise, you don't see an exponent of 1. We just kind of don't write it. If we have a highest exponent of 1, we call that polynomial linear. And if we have a highest exponent or a degree of 2, we call that quadratic, which we've done an entire chapter on. If we have our highest exponent or our degree equals 3, we call that cubic. Taking the word cube and turning it into an adjective. If we have our highest exponent of 4, in other words, our degree is 4, we call that quartic. And finally, if our highest degree or highest exponent is 5, we call that quintic. So these are some phrases that we use to classify a polynomial by the degree. There are additional adjectives we could use to describe higher powers, but for the most part we won't be doing too much work with powers higher than 5. If we wanted to classify polynomials by the number of terms, we've got some vocabulary there too. If we have one term, the root word for one is mono, so we would call that a monomial. If we have two terms in our polynomial, the root word for 2 is bi, so we would call that a binomial. The root word for 3 terms, or the number 3, is tri, and so we would call a 3-term polynomial a trinomial. And more than 3 terms, we just use the generic phrase polynomial for many. So let's take a look at some specific examples so you get the hang of the new vocabulary. So an example of a constant, we could write just a number, 110 for example. Really, I'll put it in parentheses. This is really 110 times x to the 0 power. Anything with a 0 power is the number 1. So this is 110 times the number 1. And so that's where we're getting this constant from. By degree, we call it a constant. And it's only one term. So this is a monomial. Taking a look at something linear, we could say x plus 5. Really, that's x to the 1 plus 5. We just don't write that power. As we've said above, a degree of 1, we would classify that as linear. We have 2 terms here, the x and the 5 being combined, so this is a binomial. Stepping it up, we can go to a power of 2, for example, x squared plus 2x plus 1. Power of 2, as we know, is quadratic. This happens to be written in standard form. And 3 terms would be a trinomial. And finally, we could step it up even more, x cubed plus 3x squared minus x plus 4. Our highest exponent here is a 3, so we would call this cubic. And it's got 4 terms, so generically we're just going to call this a polynomial. So in this video, we learned how to classify polynomials by both degree and number of terms, and we have a fair amount of vocab to study because we're going to be using these terms throughout the entire chapter. Okay, hope this video helps. Please subscribe.